In a small forgotten southern town, a young woman struggles with poverty yet carries a compassionate heart. When she discovers her frail old neighbor, once a devoted father now abandoned and forced to beg for food, she chooses to help him every day despite the cruel whispers around her. But when his billionaire son suddenly returns, her life will be completely transformed. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. The small southern town lay quiet under the weight of another long day. Heat clung to the cracked pavement and the sagging porches. Paint peeled like tired skin from the old houses, and the cicadas' chorus filled the dusk air with a restless hum. It was a place time had passed by, leaving dust and memory behind. Clara Johnson stood in front of her family's worn-down house, the hem of her faded skirt brushing against her knees. At just 20 years old, her shoulders carried burdens twice her age. She had learned early how to make a little stretch into enough. A pot of beans could feed her family for 3 nights if she measured carefully, if she scraped the sides of the pan and stretched the cornbread thin. She had her mother's gentle hands and her father's steady eyes, but a heart that was all her own, soft for those who suffered, quick to give even when she had little to offer. Across the dirt road she saw him again. William Turner, once the strongest man she'd ever known, shuffled toward her gate with the careful steps of a man who feared the ground might give way beneath him. His back was bent now, his frame thinned by years that had taken more than they gave. His hair, once thick and dark, hung in wisps of white. He held a small tin bowl close to his chest, dented and scratched from use, the way another man might clutch a keepsake or a Bible. Clara's throat tightened. She remembered William differently. Tall, with arms that could lift lumber and hands that could fix anything broken. She remembered his laughter carrying down the street, steady and warm, like a father's call. And she remembered the boy he had raised, Michael Carter. The whole town remembered. Michael had been the orphan no one wanted, until William took him in, fed him, clothed him, gave him everything. William had gone without supper so Michael could eat, had worked by lantern light so Michael could study. And then 8 years ago, Michael had left for the city. He had not come back. Not once. Now William stood at her gate, his eyes lowered, shame pulling his shoulders down. Clara could see the tremor in his hand as he shifted the bowl. For a long moment he didn't speak. The cicadas filled the silence. Clara's chest ached with the weight of it. Finally his voice came, low and strained. "Evening, Clara. If there's a little to spare." His words trailed off, almost swallowed by the heavy air. Clara didn't hesitate. She turned and slipped inside her kitchen, where a pot of beans simmered weakly on the stove. There wasn't much left, but enough. She ladled carefully, filling the tin bowl halfway. She tore off a piece of cornbread, still warm from the oven, and set it gently on top. Her hands shook as she carried it back, not from reluctance but from the sorrow pressing into her bones. When she returned to the porch, William was still standing where she had left him, his shoulders drawn in, his eyes fixed on the ground as if he were bracing himself for rejection. Clara held the bowl out. "Here," she said softly. "It's not much, but it's hot, and the cornbread's fresh." William looked up then, and for a heartbeat Clara saw the man he had been, the protector, the provider, the father who had carried another's child as his own. His lips parted, and his eyes glistened. He took the bowl carefully, as though it were a gift far greater than food. "Thank you, child," he whispered. His voice cracked on the last word. Across the street, 2 men leaned against a fence pretending to work on a wagon wheel, their whispers carried easily in the still air. "Would you look at that?" one muttered. The old man begging again. "Sad, ain't it?" the other replied. "His boy's a rich man now. Rich but never comes home." Clara's spine stiffened. Anger rose hot in her chest, but she bit her lip. She wanted to shout, to tell them they knew nothing of William's sacrifices, of his sleepless nights, of the bread he had gone without so Michael could have shoes for school. But she stayed silent, her fists clenched at her sides. William heard too. His shoulders flinched, just for a second, before he forced a smile onto his face. He lifted the bowl in a small gesture of thanks, as though he hadn't heard, as though he still carried enough pride to keep walking. Clara's heart broke watching him. The sight of a man who had once stood tall, now humbled to knocking on doors, to waiting at her gate with an empty bowl, it was almost too much to bear. She reached out and touched his arm lightly. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Turner," she said. "You've done more for others than most men ever would. Don't you forget that." His eyes met hers, weary but grateful. He nodded once, then turned slowly back down the path, carrying his supper as though it were treasure. Clara stood there long after he had gone, the cicada's song wrapping around her like a shroud. In the hush of the evening, she felt both anger and sorrow, not just for William, but for the boy who had left him behind. And as the shadows lengthened across the dusty street, the town itself seemed to echo the same heavy truth. Sometimes the greatest men are left to walk with empty bowls. The night after Clara handed William Turner his supper, she could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the groan of the old timbers. The image of him clutching that dented tin bowl refused to leave her mind. His fingers had trembled so hard, she feared he might spill the beans before he ever tasted them. The look in his eyes was worse, gratitude mixed with shame, as if accepting kindness was a burden heavier than hunger. By morning she had decided, no more leaving him to knock on strangers' doors, no more waiting for him to stand outside with downcast eyes. She stirred a pot of beans, measured carefully, then set a small portion aside before calling her family to eat. Her mother frowned, but said nothing. Clara kept her resolve quiet, tucked in her chest like a flame. That evening William came again. His steps were slow, his shoulders stooped, the bowl tucked to his chest. He paused at the gate, unsure whether to knock or pass on. Clara stepped out before he made the choice. "Good evening, Mr. Turner," she said. Her voice steady, she held out a plate with beans and cornbread. He raised his head, startled. "Child, you don't have to do this," he said softly. "Your family, there will always be a portion for you," Clara interrupted. "Don't go to other doors anymore, come here instead." For a long moment he stood frozen, pride and need warring inside him. Finally he reached out, his hand trembling as he accepted the food. "God bless you, Clara," he whispered. His lips quivered around the words. Clara sat on the porch rail while he ate. The dusk wrapped around them, cicadas humming their endless song. Watching him spoon beans into his mouth, she felt a memory rise, sharp and painful. Years ago, when she was no more than a little girl, she had seen him give away half a loaf of bread. A group of hungry children had gathered around his porch. He tore the bread carefully, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but crumbs. Every child walked away with food in hand. William drank only a cup of water. Clara had stood by the fence that day, too young to understand why a man would feed others and not himself. Now she knew. He had lived his whole life that way. Another memory surfaced, one whispered through the town for years: the cow. William's only cow, the one that had provided milk for him, and a little money besides. When Michael's university tuition came due, William had led that cow down the dirt road to market. Clara had watched from a distance, his figure steady, his face unreadable. By sundown the cow was gone, and by nightfall Michael's fees were paid. Folks had called it foolish. Some said he had lost his mind. But Clara understood. He had traded comfort, even survival, so his boy could walk into a classroom with dignity. Now she looked at him on her porch, hunched over a plate, his hands shaking. She thought of the cow, of the bread, of nights she had heard he worked until dawn. He had given away his strength piece by piece, until there was little left. Her eyes burned. She spoke softly, more to herself than to him. "It isn't right, after all you gave, to be left like this." William glanced at her but said nothing. He only lowered his gaze again, chewing slowly. Clara straightened her shoulders. "From now on," she said clearly, "you'll take supper here. Every night, I'll make sure of it." He froze, his spoon hovering. "People will talk," he murmured. "Let them," Clara replied. Her voice carried more steel than she expected. "I don't care what they say. You deserve better than scraps from strangers." His eyes softened, glistening under the fading light. He nodded once, as if too moved for words, then continued eating. The next day at the market, Clara heard the whispers. Two women leaning over baskets of tomatoes, their voices just loud enough. "That Johnson girl, always sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. Taking food from her own family, to feed that old man. Foolish girl. Too soft." Clara's cheeks flushed, but she kept walking, her basket clutched tight. Their words stung, but her decision held firm. That evening William returned, and she met him again with a plate. The routine began, night after night. At first he barely spoke, ashamed of needing so much, but slowly, words slipped free. He told her about the mill where he once worked, about summers when the fields were green and full, about Michael running barefoot across the yard, laughing as though joy were endless. His stories always drifted into silence when the boy's name lingered too long. His eyes would turn distant, his spoon resting forgotten. Clara never pressed, she listened, she let him remember. Over the weeks his steps grew steadier, his shoulders less bowed. Clara found herself listening for the sound of his approach each evening. The cough that preceded him no longer made her heart sink but stirred a quiet readiness. Neighbors kept whispering. That girl will wear herself thin, they said. Kindness doesn't fill an empty belly. But Clara saw something they didn't. She saw the way William lifted his head a little higher now. She saw how dignity began to return, not in grand ways but in the small tilt of his shoulders, in the clearer tone of his voice. One night, as the cicadas sang and the last light faded, William lingered after finishing his meal. He set the plate down gently and looked at Clara. A faint smile touched his lips. "You remind me of something I once believed," he said quietly. Clara tilted her head. "What's that?" "That kindness is never wasted," he replied. His eyes glimmered with something between sorrow and hope. "Even when the world forgets, even when those you gave everything to never return, kindness still matters." Clara felt her throat tighten. She reached out, laying a hand on his thin arm. "It does, Mr. Turner. It always does." And so their bond grew, built not on riches or grand gestures, but on bread, beans and the simple act of refusing to let a good man be forgotten. At that very moment, miles away from the dusty roads of the South, a rooftop party in the heart of New York City glowed against the night sky. The city hummed below, restless and bright, while music from a live band spilled out into the humid summer air. Crystal glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and the elite of finance and technology circled each other like dancers rehearsing the same steps they had performed 100 times before. In the middle of it all stood Michael Carter. He wore a tuxedo cut sharp to his frame, his hair styled for the cameras, his smile practiced until it felt like part of his skin. Guests pressed close to him, with congratulations, laughter, questions about his next venture. A woman in a sequined gown leaned against his arm, whispering something playful in his ear. Michael laughed on cue, his eyes however stayed fixed on the skyline. The city glittered back at him, a promise he had chased for years, and now held in his hands. Then his assistant tapped his shoulder, and handed him a phone. "A producer from Channel 8, she said. "They want you on the line." Michael stepped away from the music into a quieter corner of the terrace. The voice on the phone was smooth, persuasive. "Mr. Carter, America knows your name. They know the billions, the buildings, the brand, but they don't know your journey. We want to give them that. A prime-time special, your story, from dirt roads to digital empires. The boy who had nothing, who built everything." Michael felt the words stroke his ego like a familiar hand. He watched his reflection in the glass, the tuxedo, the city's firelight glittering against his polished shoes. The producer continued, "We'll film here in the city, but we'll also travel back to your hometown, the house you grew up in, the school, the streets, the people. We want to show where you began, so everyone can see how far you've come." For a moment, Michael's throat tightened. The word hometown pulled an image from the depths of memory. A porch sagging under the weight of years, a man with strong hands pressing a shirt until the creases were perfect, a laugh that filled summer air. He blinked quickly, swallowing hard. Then he straightened his cuffs, forced a smile no one could see. "Yes," he said. "That sounds perfect." He told himself William Turner was surely fine. The old man had always been tough, always found a way. He probably sits on that porch still. Michael thought, shirt pressed, shoes shined, waiting for me to come back. The thought soothed him just enough to tuck it away. He returned to the party with his smile in place and a new story to sell. 2 weeks later, the limousine rolled into the town Michael once called home. The sky was pale with heat, cicadas buzzing in the trees, dust lifting behind the tires. A camera van followed close behind, its crew eager to catch every frame of contrast between the billionaire and the place that raised him. Perfect backdrop, the director muttered, tapping the glass as they passed a leaning fence and a porch with broken steps. We'll shoot you stepping out right here. America will eat it up. Small town, big dream, classic. Michael nodded, rehearsing his lines silently. I learned to stretch $1. I learned to fix what I couldn't buy. The words were polished, safe, meant to inspire. He imagined how they would sound against the backdrop of peeling paint and rusted mailboxes. He imagined the applause. The limousine stopped. A crewman swung the door open. Michael stepped out into sunlight so bright it burned his eyes. Cameras whirred, lenses lifted, microphones tilted toward him. He squared his shoulders, buttoned his jacket, and prepared to walk down memory's road with the stride of a man who had conquered it. But a sound interrupted him. Small, metallic, almost lost under the cicadas. A spoon tapping against a bowl. Michael turned his head. Across the street, on a porch shaded by tired curtains, Clara Johnson stood with a ladle in her hand. Her faded dress clung to her in the heat, but her back was straight, her movements steady. Beside her sat William Turner. His hair, white as cotton left too long in the sun, framed a face drawn thin by years. He held a tin bowl close to his chest, the same one Michael remembered from childhood, dented and scarred, but still in use. Clara poured stew into the bowl, careful not to spill. She tore a piece of cornbread and placed it gently on top. William's hands trembled as he accepted it, his lips moving in a quiet thank you. The director whispered urgently, "Hold the shot, hold that." Cameras shifted, catching the exchange, the fragility of the moment. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. His mouth went dry. The scene before him sliced through every polished line he had prepared. There was William, the man who had gone without food so Michael could eat, now eating from a bowl of charity. There was Clara, the young woman who had taken the place of a son who should have been there. From the fence across the road, two men whispered loud enough for microphones to catch. "Ain't that Turner? That's his boy, isn't it? The rich one, rich as sin," the other answered. "And look at his daddy now, begging scraps." The words hit Michael harder than any headline ever had. He staggered a half step, his polished shoes grinding dust. He lifted a hand as if to steady himself, but the gesture only made him look small against the lens. Clara noticed him then. Her eyes flicked toward the limousine, toward the man in the dark suit. Her grip on the ladle tightened. She did not speak, but the silence in her stare said everything. William raised his head slowly, as though dragged upward by some unseen weight. His eyes met Michael's from across the road. Recognition spread over his face, not quick, but inevitable. For a moment, pride lifted his shoulders, the same pride that once carried a boy through school, through hunger, through life. Then his shoulders sagged again. He drew the bowl closer to his chest, as if to shield it from pity. The cameras drank in every detail, the tremor in William's hand, the cornbread breaking, the billionaire frozen on the curb. The crew knew they had stumbled into a truth no script could capture. Michael tried to summon his lines. "I worked hard, I rose from nothing." But the words tangled and died. All he could see was the man who had sold his only cow for tuition, who had fed a boy bread and eaten water himself, now taking food from a neighbor's daughter while the world watched. He felt the world tilt, the image he had built, sharp suits, tall towers, glowing screens, cracked in the sunlight of a small town porch. And in the space of a breath, the story he thought he was telling slipped from his hands and shattered at his feet. The street had fallen into a hush that felt like a storm holding its breath. Cameras kept rolling, neighbors leaned on fences, and Michael Carter stood frozen in a suit that suddenly felt 2 sizes too small. Across from him, William Turner held his bowl close, his fingers trembling, his chin lifted just enough to keep what dignity he could. Clara Johnson stood at his side, the ladle still gripped tight in her hand, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. Her voice broke the silence. It cracked, raw and unrestrained, carrying farther than she meant. "He starved himself to raise you," she cried, her eyes wet. "He gave up his own food so you could eat, his strength so you could stand tall, his life so you could have one. And where were you when he needed you? You left him to beg spoonfuls at strangers' doors. Tell me, Michael Carter, is that what you call success?" The words cut through the summer air like a whip. Neighbors gasped, some covering their mouths, others nodding fiercely. Clara's voice trembled but did not falter. She stepped forward, the ladle still in her hand, as though it were a weapon of truth. All your money, all your cameras, all your speeches, none of it can erase the fact that the man who raised you is standing here with an empty bowl. A murmur swelled from the crowd. One man by the fence spat into the dust. Shameful, he muttered, and another agreed, louder this time, a billionaire who lets his own father go hungry. Voices rose, building like a wave, ungrateful, forgotten his roots, turned his back on the man who made him. The sound of judgment echoed down the street, each word striking like stones. The cameramen kept their lenses trained, their eyes wide. They knew they were catching more than a story, they were catching a reckoning. Michael felt the heat of their eyes, the sting of their voices. His chest heaved. He tried to form words, but his throat locked. Shame pressed down harder than the sun overhead. He saw his life, the towers of glass and steel, the magazine covers, the champagne nights, and all of it seemed flimsy now, shadows that shriveled in the harsh light of a single truth spoken aloud. Then a different sound came, one gentler, older. William Turner cleared his throat. His hand shook as he lowered the spoon, but his voice carried steady enough to silence the crowd for a heartbeat. "Don't blame him," William said, turning his weary face toward the neighbors. "Don't blame my boy." Clara looked at him in disbelief, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Mr. Turner, how can you?" William raised a hand, thin and trembling, but firm in its intent. "He has his troubles, he has his burdens. I know he does, he hasn't forgotten me, he just hasn't found his way back yet." His lips curved into something close to a smile. "He will, I believe that." The crowd murmured, this time with confusion, with unease. Some shook their heads, others frowned, but none could miss the sight of an old man, frail and hungry, defending the very son who had abandoned him. The contradiction was almost unbearable. Michael's heart pounded so hard, he thought the cameras might hear it. His eyes burned as he watched William stand there, shielding him from the anger of the town, shielding him with nothing but his faith. The man who should have been the accuser, had become his defender. The one who had suffered most offered forgiveness freely without hesitation, and that mercy, that unshakable mercy, struck Michael deeper than all the accusations. He felt shame tighten around him like chains, felt his chest ache with a guilt he could not hide. For the first time in years, Michael Carter, billionaire, master of glass towers and glowing screens, stood not as a success, not as a symbol but as a son, small, broken, and undeserving in the shadow of the man who had once starved so he could live. The town watched, the cameras whirred. The silence after William's words pressed heavy, as if the whole world waited for what Michael would do next. The silence of the street hung heavy, as if even the cicadas had stopped to listen. Dust floated in the air, golden in the late sun, and the cameras hummed as they captured every angle. Michael Carter stood stiff in his dark suit, his polished shoes planted on the cracked pavement. Across from him, William Turner clutched his bowl of stew, his frail body bent with age, his eyes lowered in quiet shame. Clara Johnson stood beside him, the ladle still in her hand, her jaw clenched, her eyes brimming. Then her voice broke the stillness. It was not soft, not cautious, it came sharp, cutting the air like a blade. "He starved himself to raise you," Clara cried, her voice shaking but loud enough for the whole street to hear. Her tears spilled as she stepped forward, pointing the ladle toward Michael as though it were proof. "He gave you every meal he never ate, every coin he never spent, every night he never rested. And where were you when he needed you? You left him to beg, spoon by spoon, at strangers' doors." The crowd gasped. A woman near the fence covered her mouth. A man shook his head and muttered, "Lord have mercy." Clara's voice rose higher, fueled by years of silent witnessing. "You call yourself a success. Is this what success looks like? A father with an empty bowl while his son drinks from crystal glasses in some faraway tower. Tell us, Michael Carter, is that the empire you built?" The ladle in her hand trembled, but her words did not falter. "Look at him," she shouted. "Look at the man who carried you on his shoulders when you were too small to walk, who worked until his hands bled so you could learn your letters, who sold the only cow he owned so you could stand in a college classroom. And now he stands here, trembling, waiting for scraps. If this is your success, then God help us all." A murmur rose from the neighbors, first low, then louder, voices stacking one over another like a rising tide. Ungrateful, someone hissed. A man with all that money, and his father starving, another said bitterly. Forgot his blood, forgot his roots, a third voice called. Soon the air was full of accusation, a chorus of anger and disappointment. The street became a courtroom without walls, the neighbors its jury, the cameras its scribes. Michael felt the weight of every word pressed down like stones on his chest. His throat tightened. He tried to breathe, to speak, to explain, but no words came. His carefully polished story crumbled, leaving only silence and shame. He saw the faces around him, faces that had once cheered his scholarship, faces that had watched him leave with pride, and now they stared with disgust. His legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself wanted to pull him down. But then came another voice, quieter, older, breaking through the storm like a weak beam of light. William Turner cleared his throat. The sound was rough, but enough to hush the crowd for a moment. He shifted the bowl closer to his chest, and lifted his trembling hand. "Don't," he said. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out again, steadier this time. "Don't blame him." The neighbors fell still, surprised. Clara turned sharply, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mr. Turner, how can you?" William shook his head, his lips pressed into something like a smile. "He's had his burdens. Life in the city isn't easy. Maybe he lost his way, maybe he thought I was stronger than I am. But he hasn't forgotten me. Not my boy, he just hasn't found the road back yet." His words stunned the crowd. A few scoffed, shaking their heads. "Foolish old man," someone muttered, defending the one who left him. Another said, softer, "That's love. Only love would speak like that." Clara's tears spilled faster. She dropped the ladle to her side and pressed her hand to her chest. "He left you with nothing," she whispered. "And still you protect him." William looked at her, then at Michael, his eyes clouded but steady. "Because he is my son, and a father does not give up on his child." The words landed like a hammer against Michael's ribs. He staggered, his lips parting but no sound coming out. Shame burned through him, hotter than the summer sun. He could have faced their anger. He could have borne their scorn. But this disquiet forgiveness from the man he had wronged most, this undid him completely. The crowd murmured again, restless, unsure. Some shook their heads at William's mercy, others wiped their eyes, moved despite themselves. The cameras zoomed in, catching every detail, the tears on Clara's face, the trembling in William's hand, the shock written on Michael's. Michael's vision blurred. He blinked, but the sting only grew sharper. He saw not the billionaire in the glass towers, not the headlines or the applause. He saw himself as a boy, knees scraped, head bowed over homework, while William lit the lamp and worked late into the night, whispering encouragements he barely heard. He saw the man who had gone without bread, so he could have a meal, now raising his voice not to accuse but to defend. And that was the cruelest mercy of all. The neighbor's judgment still rang, the cameras still rolled, but Michael heard only his father's words echoing in his chest. "He is my son. I will not give up on him." The mercy tore through him, leaving him hollow, raw and unbearably ashamed. He lowered his head, unable to meet William's eyes, unable to meet Clara's tears, unable to meet the town's stares. For the first time in years, the man the world admired stood not triumphant, but undone. The weight of silence pressed against Michael Carter's chest until he could no longer bear it. His shoulders sagged, his polished mask cracked, and his eyes brimmed. Before the town, before the cameras, before the man who had given him life, he broke. His voice shook as it spilled into the hot evening air. "I let the city lights blind me," he confessed, his words raw. "I let the noise drown out the truth. I forgot the one who gave me breath, who gave me everything I am." The crowd hushed. The neighbors who had shouted now leaned forward, caught between judgment and mercy. Clara held her breath, her hands trembling against her skirt. William Turner stood still, his bowl pressed to his chest, his eyes fixed on the son who had finally spoken. Michael lifted his face to the crowd, his tears running freely. From this day he declared, louder now, stronger with each word, "My father will never stand on a porch with an empty bowl again." He will never beg for food, he will live with me, under my roof, at my table, and the world will know his name. The world will know that William Turner is the man who raised me, the man who gave me everything." Gasps rose, followed by murmurs. Some nodded, some wiped their eyes, others crossed their arms, wary but moved. The cameras caught it all, the billionaire's vow echoing down a small town street. Michael's legs bent, and for the first time in his life as a man, he knelt in front of William. Dust clung to his knees, his suit creased, but he did not care. He reached for his father's hand, thin and rough with years of labor. He pressed his lips against it, his tears falling over skin calloused by sacrifice. "Forgive me, Dad," he whispered, voice breaking. "Forgive me for every year I stayed away." William's hand trembled, but his smile was steady. It was the same smile he had worn when Michael was a boy with scraped knees, the same smile that promised everything would be all right. His eyes softened, and with a gentle squeeze, he answered without words, "Forgiveness had been there all along." The crowd grew quiet, not in judgment now, but in reverence. Even Clara, who had cried out in fury, felt her anger cool into something else. Relief, hope. The sight of a son kneeling, a father forgiving, was more powerful than any accusation could be. Weeks passed, and the town watched as Michael Carter changed. The parties, the endless headlines, the hollow victories, he let them go. He worked with a steadiness that surprised even his own boardrooms. He made fewer speeches, and more promises kept. And when he returned home, it was not to a limousine and cameras, but to bring William Turner with him. William entered a house he never dreamed of, a mansion glowing on the hill. Staff bowed, but Michael waved them away. He opened every door himself, led his father through every hall. At the long dining table, plates gleamed, and food overflowed. But William bowed his head, whispering grace just as he had when he ate bread crusts alone. This time, he whispered not for survival, but for gratitude, and Clara was there too. Michael had not forgotten her, the young woman who had stood firm, who had fed William when he had not. He offered her a place not out of pity, but of honor. "You carried what I should have carried," he told her. "Let me repay that debt." Clara accepted the job he gave her, steady and secure, a new life carved out of her own kindness. Nights at the mansion were not filled with parties, but with something quieter, deeper. Laughter returned, not the hollow kind that echoed in ballrooms, but the simple laughter of shared meals and remembered stories. One evening, as the staff cleared the plates, Michael looked down the long table at William seated at the head. The old man's shoulders were no longer hunched in shame. His eyes gleamed softly in the chandelier's light. He smiled, peaceful, unburdened, content. Michael felt his chest loosen, the guilt that once strangled him easing into something like redemption. He knew now what wealth truly meant. Money could build towers, but not homes. Money could fill rooms with strangers, but not family. Only love, only sacrifice, only honor could build what lasted. The mansion glowed against the night, but inside, it was not marble or glass that shone brightest. It was the quiet dignity of a father restored, the humility of a son reclaimed, and the kindness of a young woman who refused to let goodness die. At that table, William Turner lifted his head, his smile gentle, his heart at rest. For the first time in years, he was not a man with an empty bowl. He was a father, surrounded by love, his family whole again.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.